I noticed it on the day I first met her. Not something loud. Not something obvious. Just the absence of something. A smile. Most people, when they meet their future mother-in-law for the first time, try at least a little. A polite smile. A nervous one. Something small to smooth the moment. But when Daniel introduced her, she only nodded. Her lips stayed still. Her face calm. Almost distant. "This is Emma," Daniel said proudly. "The woman I've been telling you about." She looked at me directly. Her eyes were sharp and observant, almost as if she were studying something. "Nice to meet you," she said. "No es mal." At the time I assumed she was nervous. Some people don't show emotions easily. I smiled warmly. "Welcome to the family." That was 10 years ago. And during those 10 years, something strange remained the same. Emma never smiled at me. Not once. It sounds like such a small detail. Something easy to ignore. But the human mind notices patterns. And when a pattern lasts for years, it begins to feel intentional. At family dinners, she smiled at Daniel. At friends. At waiters. At neighbors. But whenever our eyes met, her expression returned to that calm, neutral look. Not hostile. Not rude. Just closed. At first, I tried to convince myself it meant nothing. People have their reasons. Maybe she was shy. Maybe she simply didn't like me. That happens too. But the strange thing was, she was never openly unkind. She helped set the table. She brought gifts on holidays. She asked polite questions. "How have you been, Margaret? How is the garden this year?" Her voice was always respectful. Yet the distance remained. And slowly, quietly, the absence of a smile began to feel louder than words. Daniel never seemed to notice. Or maybe he didn't want to. "Emma just has a serious personality," he told me once when I mentioned it. "Some people aren't very expressive." That explanation satisfied him. But it never quite satisfied me. Because I watched carefully. And Emma could smile. I had seen it many times. Just not at me. The first truly uncomfortable moment happened 3 years after their wedding. It was Christmas. Our family had gathered at my house, just like we always did. The dining room was full of laughter, warm lights, and the smell of roasted turkey. Emma sat across the table from me. At one point Daniel told a story from his childhood about the time he tried to build a treehouse and accidentally nailed the ladder to the wrong side of the tree. Everyone laughed. Even Emma. A real laugh. Her whole face softened, brightened. For a moment she looked completely different. Warm, open, almost joyful. Then she noticed me watching her. And just like that, the smile disappeared. As if someone had flipped a switch. Her expression returned to that calm mask. That was the moment something inside me tightened. Because people don't turn their emotions off like that without a reason. Over the next few years, I tried different approaches. I invited her for coffee. I gave thoughtful birthday gifts. Once I even asked her directly, "Emma," I said gently during one visit, "have I ever done something to make you uncomfortable?" She looked surprised. "No. You seem a little distant with me sometimes." Her answer came quickly. "I'm just a quiet person." And that was the end of the conversation. But the most confusing part of all was how much Daniel loved her. He truly adored her. He spoke about her with warmth and pride. "She's the most honest person I've ever met," he told me once. Very direct. Direct. That word stayed in my mind. Because there was one thing Emma was never direct about. Her feelings toward me. Years passed. And the pattern continued. Birthdays. Thanksgivings. Family barbecues. Emma remained polite. Respectful. But always distant. Always serious. Always without a smile. After a while, I began to accept that this was simply how our relationship would be. Not warm. Not hostile. Just careful. But life has a way of revealing things when you least expect it. And the truth about Emma's silence came out on an ordinary afternoon that started with something very simple. A broken phone. It happened 6 years after their wedding. Daniel had stopped by my house to help fix the kitchen sink. While he worked under the counter, his phone buzzed repeatedly on the table. "Can you check that?" he called. "It might be Emma." I picked up the phone. The screen lit up with a message notification. Emma. But the message preview showed only a few words before the screen locked again. Still, those few words were enough to make my heart skip. Because the message began like this. "Did your mother say anything strange again today?" I stared at the screen. Daniel's voice came from under the sink. "What did she say?" I hesitated. "Just asking how things are going." He chuckled. "She worries too much." I set the phone back on the table slowly, but something had shifted in my mind. "Did your mother say anything strange again today?" Again. That word suggested a pattern. A conversation. Something being discussed regularly between them. Something about me. And suddenly the quiet distance Emma had kept for years began to feel less like shyness, and more like something very deliberate. That night I couldn't sleep, because for the first time, a disturbing thought crossed my mind. What if Emma's silence wasn't discomfort? What if it was caution? As if she were carefully watching me, waiting, measuring every word I said. And if that was true, then the real question wasn't why she never smiled at me. The real question was, what exactly did she think I had done? The answer to that question would come sooner than I expected. And when I finally learned the reason Emma had never smiled at me for all those years, it forced me to confront something I had buried so deeply in the past that I believed no one would ever discover it again. Especially not my son's wife. But Emma had discovered it. And the way she did was something I never could have predicted. That message stayed in my mind for days. "Did your mother say anything strange again today?" The word again echoed louder each time I thought about it. It meant Emma and Daniel had talked about me before. More than once. And not in a casual way. In a careful way. In the following weeks I found myself observing Emma differently. Not suspiciously, but more attentively. At the next family dinner, she arrived with Daniel as usual. She brought a bottle of wine, greeted everyone politely, and helped in the kitchen. Everything looked normal. Yet now that I knew about that message, small details began to stand out. Emma watched people very closely. Not in a rude way. More like someone quietly collecting information. When people spoke, she listened more than she talked. When someone told a story, her eyes studied their face carefully. And sometimes, when she thought no one noticed, she looked at me with a strange expression. Not dislike. Not anger. Something closer to concern. That confused me even more. If she disliked me, I could understand that. But concern? About what? About 2 months after the phone incident, something else happened. Daniel and Emma hosted a small dinner at their house. Nothing formal. Just a few friends and family members. The evening started pleasantly. Conversation flowed. Wine glasses clinked, and music played softly in the background. At one point I stepped outside to the patio for fresh air. The night was cool and quiet. I stood there alone for a few minutes. Then the sliding door opened behind me. Emma stepped out. For a moment we both stood silently, looking at the dark garden. Then she said something unexpected. "You don't like being in crowded rooms for too long." It wasn't a question. More like an observation. I looked at her. "I don't mind them." "But you leave them often." Her voice was calm. Careful. I shrugged lightly. "Sometimes I just need a little quiet." Emma nodded slowly, as if confirming something. Then she said something else. "You also change the subject when people ask about your early years." Now I looked at her more closely. "What do you mean?" "At family gatherings," she said, "when someone asks about your life before Daniel was born, you usually redirect the conversation." Her tone was neutral, but the words made a strange chill run through me. "That's not unusual," I said. "Everyone has parts of their past they don't talk about much." Emma watched me for a long moment. Then she nodded again. "Yes." Another silence fell between us. The house behind us was full of laughter. But out there on the patio, the atmosphere felt strangely tense. Finally, Emma spoke again. I hope you don't misunderstand something. What? My distance. I waited. She looked away toward the garden. It's not personal. That sentence was both reassuring and unsettling. Because if it wasn't personal, then what was it? Emma, I said gently, you've been distant with me for years. Yes. Why? She hesitated. And for the first time since I had known her, I saw uncertainty in her expression. I'm not ready to answer that question yet. That answer was both honest and deeply unsettling. Yet, I repeated. She nodded slightly. Then she added something that stayed with me long after that night. I just want to be sure. Sure of what? But Emma didn't answer. Instead, she said quietly, dinner is getting cold. And she walked back inside. I stood on the patio alone for several minutes after that. Her words echoed in my mind. I just want to be sure. Sure of what? The following months were strangely quiet. Emma behaved exactly the same as before. Polite, respectful, serious. But something subtle had changed. Sometimes I caught her looking at me with an expression that almost looked conflicted, as if two thoughts were fighting inside her mind. And then one afternoon, something happened that made everything even stranger. Daniel came to visit me alone. We sat in the living room drinking tea. At one point he said casually, Emma asked me something interesting yesterday. Oh, she asked if you ever lived in Chicago. My hand froze slightly on the teacup. Just for a second. But Daniel noticed. Did you? I placed the cup back on the table. Yes, I said slowly. For a few years. When? Before you were born. He nodded. That's what I told her. And why is she asking? He shrugged. I think she's just curious about family history. Curious. That word made my chest tighten. Because Chicago wasn't just a city from my past. It was a chapter of my life I had closed very carefully. A chapter connected to mistakes. To choices. To things I had spent years making sure stayed buried. That night I couldn't sleep again. Emma's strange questions. Her careful observations. Her message to Daniel. Her distance for 10 years. And now, Chicago. The pieces didn't make sense yet. But something inside me knew one thing for certain. Emma wasn't simply curious. She was investigating. And if she kept digging in the direction she had started, sooner or later she would discover the one secret from my past that I had hoped no one, especially my son, would ever learn. What I didn't know then was this. Emma was already much closer to that truth than I imagined. And the reason she had started looking in the first place was something that would shock me even more than the secret itself. After Daniel mentioned Chicago, the quiet tension between Emma and me became impossible to ignore. Not openly. Not in any way that others could see. But beneath the polite conversations and family dinners, something had clearly changed. Emma had started watching me even more carefully. And the strange part was she didn't seem hostile. If anything, she looked troubled. That almost made it worse. Because trouble means questions. And questions eventually lead to answers. About 2 weeks after Daniel's visit, Emma called me. It was the first time in 10 years that she had ever called me directly. Not through Daniel. Not about holiday plans. Just called. When I saw her name on my phone, I stared at the screen for a few seconds before answering. Hello, Emma. Marveit. Her voice sounded calm, but slightly tense. Are you busy today? No. I was wondering if we could talk. Of course. There was a small pause. In person, she added. That pause told me something important. This wasn't going to be a casual conversation. All right, I said. Would you like to come over? Another pause. Yes. She arrived about an hour later. I watched from the window as her car pulled into the driveway. She sat inside the car for a full minute before getting out. That alone told me how serious this was. Emma was not the type of person who hesitated easily. When she walked into the house, she looked around the living room quietly. Not nervously. more like someone preparing to confirm something they had suspected for a long time. There, I offered. Yes, thank you. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table. For a moment neither of us spoke. Finally Emma reached into her bag and pulled out a thin folder. My stomach tightened immediately, because people don't bring folders to casual conversations. She placed it on the table, but she didn't open it yet. Instead she looked at me carefully. I want to say something first. I waited. For years, she said slowly. I've probably seemed cold toward you. That's fair to say. She nodded slightly. I'm sorry for that. That sentence surprised me, because I had expected tension, accusation, not an apology. But, she continued, there's a reason. I assume that. Emma took a slow breath. I work in investigative journalism. That statement landed heavier than she probably intended, because suddenly everything began to make sense. Her observations, her questions, her careful attention to details. You investigate people, I said. Yes. And you've been investigating me. She didn't deny it. Yes. For a moment we simply looked at each other across the table. Why? I asked quietly. Emma finally opened the folder. Inside were several documents. Old records. Photocopies. Notes. She slid one of the pages toward me. At the top of the page was a name. Margaret Collins. My name. Below it was something I hadn't seen in nearly 35 years. A newspaper clipping. The headline was small, but the words were still clear. Young woman questioned in financial fraud case. My chest tightened instantly, because I remembered that article. I remembered that time in my life. And I remembered how hard I had worked to leave it behind. Emma watched my reaction carefully. You recognize it? Yes. That case happened in Chicago, she said. Yes. Her voice remained steady. The woman in the article has the same name as you. Yes. And the same birth date. I nodded slowly. So the question is simple, Emma said. Was that you? There was no point denying it. Yes. Emma leaned back slightly. And you never told Daniel? No. Silence filled the kitchen. For a moment Emma looked almost disappointed. But not in the way I expected. Not angry. More conflicted. Finally she asked the question she had clearly been carrying for years. Why didn't you tell him? I looked down at the newspaper clipping. That version of me felt like a stranger now. You know what investigative stories are like, I said. They don't always show the full picture. Emma didn't argue with that. What happened? She asked. I sighed slowly. 35 years ago I worked at a small accounting firm in Chicago. Emma listened carefully. The company's owner was involved in illegal financial schemes. Fraud. Yes. Were you part of it? No. Then why were you questioned? Because I worked there. And the records had your name. Yes. Emma studied my face closely. You were never charged. No. Why? Because I wasn't involved. She was silent for a long moment. Then she said something unexpected. I know that. Now it was my turn to be surprised. You do. Emma nodded. I finished the investigation 2 years ago. 2 years. That meant she had been carrying this knowledge quietly for a long time. Then why? I started. Why didn't I smile at you? Yes. She leaned forward slightly. And for the first time since I had known her, her expression softened. Because the story didn't end there. My stomach tightened again. What do you mean? Emma pulled out another document and slid it across the table. This one wasn't a newspaper article. It was a police report. And at the bottom of the page was a name that made my heart stop for a moment. A name I hadn't heard in decades. David Mercer. Emma looked directly into my eyes. Do you remember him? Of course I remembered him. He was the real reason that entire scandal had nearly destroyed my life. But what Emma said next shocked me even more. My father was the investigator who worked that case. The room suddenly felt very quiet. And Emma continued softly. And David Mercer was my uncle. For a few seconds I simply stared at Emma. The name David Mercer echoed in my mind like something pulled from a locked room in my memory. Yes, I finally said quietly. I remember him. Emma watched my face carefully. You look surprised. I am. She folded her hands on the table. My father was the detective assigned to the financial fraud case at the firm where you worked. That alone was shocking enough. But the next part was worse. And David Mercer, she continued slowly, was my mother's younger brother. I leaned back in my chair. The past, which had been quiet for so many years, suddenly felt very close again. I didn't know that, I said. I didn't think you did. Emma's voice remained calm, but there was a weight behind it. When I first met Daniel, she continued, I had no idea who you were. That makes sense. Then one evening, about 2 months after we started dating, Daniel showed me an old photo. I already knew what photo she meant. Daniel kept a framed picture of us from when he was a little boy. It was the one of you and Daniel at the lake, Emma said. You were standing next to him on the dock. Yes. I recognized you immediately. My stomach tightened. You recognized me from the case. Yes. The room felt quiet again. Emma continued. At first I thought it was just a coincidence. Same name, similar face, but many years had passed. But you checked. Yes. That didn't surprise me anymore. Emma wasn't the type of person who ignored doubts. I started looking into the old case files, she said. And what did you find? Her eyes met mine. You were questioned as a possible accomplice. Yes. But the charges were dropped. Yes. You moved away shortly afterward. Yes. Emma nodded slightly. All of that matched the records. I exhaled slowly. I told you earlier, I said. I wasn't involved in the fraud. I know. Her answer came quickly. Too quickly. You know? Yes. I frowned slightly. Then why investigate me for 10 years? Emma hesitated. Then she said something that made the tension return immediately. Because my uncle went to prison. I know. And he always said one thing before he died. I felt something cold settle in my chest. What did he say? Emma didn't look away. He said someone inside the firm betrayed him. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt heavier. And he believed that person was you. For a moment neither of us spoke. The accusation hung in the air between us. I see, I said quietly. Emma studied my face. You don't look angry. No. Why not? Because I understand why you would want to know the truth. And what is the truth? I leaned forward slightly. The truth, I said slowly, is more complicated than your uncle believed. Emma waited. He wasn't betrayed by me. Then by who? The owner of the company. Emma shook her head slightly. That's not what the records suggest. That's because the records were incomplete. She watched me carefully. Explain. I stood up and walked to the living room. From a drawer in the old cabinet, I pulled out something I hadn't touched in decades. A thin envelope. I returned to the kitchen and placed it on the table. Emma looked at it curiously. What is this? Something I kept in case the past ever came back to find me. She opened the envelope slowly. Inside were several old documents. One of them was a letter. Another was a copy of an internal memo from the accounting firm. Emma began reading. Her eyes moved quickly across the page. Then her expression changed. Confusion. Then surprise. Then something closer to shock. This memo, she said slowly. Yes. It says the company owner ordered several employees to falsify financial reports. That's correct. And your name is listed here. Yes. But there's a note next to it. Emma read the line out loud. Refused participation. She looked up at me. You refused to cooperate. Yes. And after that? They fired me. Emma frowned. But the fraud investigation started weeks later. Yes. She looked back at the document. And the person who replaced you was David Mercer? Yes. Emma sat very still for a moment, processing, rearranging pieces of information she had believed for years. My uncle told our family he was forced into the scheme, she said slowly. That part might be true. But he also said someone tipped off the investigators. I nodded. That part is also true. Emma's eyes narrowed slightly. You. Yes. Silence filled the room. The realization hit her slowly. You reported the company. Yes. And the investigation began because of you. Yes. Emma leaned back in her chair. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she whispered something that sounded more to herself than to me. That changes everything. I shook my head slightly. No, I said quietly. It actually makes things worse. Emma looked at me again. What do you mean? Because your uncle didn't know I was the one who reported the company. She frowned. Then why did he think you betrayed him? I sighed slowly. Because someone told him I did. Emma's eyes sharpened again. Who? I held her gaze. The company owner. Emma's voice became very quiet. Why would he do that? Because he needed someone to blame. And your uncle believed him? Yes. Emma sat there silently for a long time. Then she asked the question that had probably been haunting her for years. So my uncle spent the rest of his life believing you destroyed him? Yes. And you never corrected that? I looked down at the old documents. There was no way to. Emma frowned. What do you mean? Your uncle never spoke to me again after the trial. She was quiet. Then she asked softly, and my father? I looked up at her. He knew. Emma blinked. My father knew the truth? Yes. And he never told our family? No. Why? Because the case ended with a conviction. The system had already moved on. Emma's expression slowly shifted from confusion to something deeper. A realization that made the entire situation far more complicated than she had believed. For 10 years she had kept her distance from me, because she thought I might have destroyed her uncle's life. But now the story looked very different. And yet, there was still one piece of the truth she didn't know. A piece that made the situation far more morally complicated than simple innocence. Emma looked at me again. There's something else, she said quietly. Yes. You said earlier that the truth is more complicated. That's right. What did you mean? I took a slow breath. Because the next part of the story was the one I had never told anyone. Not even Daniel. The truth, I said carefully, is that your uncle might never have gone to prison. Emma leaned forward slightly. If I had made a different decision. Her voice dropped to a whisper. What decision? I looked directly into her eyes. The decision to stay silent. Emma didn't move. For a long moment she simply stared at me, as if trying to understand whether what she had just heard was real. The decision to stay silent, she repeated slowly. Yes. Her eyes searched my face. You mean, if you hadn't reported the company, your uncle might never have gone to prison? The words sat heavily between us. Emma leaned back in her chair, processing everything. For years she had believed one version of the story. Now the entire narrative had shifted. But that would mean the fraud continued, she said. Yes. And hundreds of people would have lost their savings. Yes. She looked down at the documents again. So your choice was either protect the people being cheated, or protect the people inside the company. Emma nodded slowly. And you chose the first? Yes. Silence filled the kitchen. Emma rubbed her temples gently. This is not the story my family believes. I imagined it wouldn't be. She looked at me again. My uncle always said he was set up. He might have believed that. But you're saying he knowingly participated. I hesitated. Then I answered honestly. At first, I think he was just following orders. Emma listened carefully. But later he started signing documents himself. She closed the folder slowly. And the investigators found those documents. Yes. My father never told us any of this. That was probably intentional. Emma sighed quietly. For 10 years she had kept emotional distance from me. Not hostility, but suspicion. And now she was realizing that suspicion had been built on incomplete information. Finally she asked the question that had clearly been sitting in her mind. Why didn't you ever tell Daniel? I smiled sadly. Imagine telling your son that his mother once testified in a federal fraud investigation. Emma didn't respond immediately. He's an adult, she said. Yes. But he's also my son. She nodded slowly. That kind of story changes how people see you. Yes. Emma looked down at the table again. And that's why you never defended yourself when I kept my distance. Yes. You must have known why I was acting that way. I suspected. And you never confronted me. No. Why? I shrugged slightly. Because you were protecting your family. Emma looked surprised by that answer. You weren't angry? Oh, I was hurt sometimes. She looked down. I probably deserved that. But I also understood something. I said. What? That you loved Daniel. Emma looked up again. Of course I do. And that you would never marry him if you thought I had destroyed your uncle's life. That realization seemed to hit her deeply. I spent years trying to decide if you were dangerous to my husband, she admitted quietly. I figured. I checked records, talked to old contacts, even visited Chicago once. I raised an eyebrow slightly. You were thorough. I had to be. And what conclusion did you reach? Emma leaned back in her chair. For years, I couldn't be sure. And now, she looked around the quiet kitchen, the old cabinets, the kettle on the stove, the small window looking out into the backyard. Then she looked back at me. Now I think I finally understand something. What's that? You're not the person I thought you might be. I smiled slightly. That's good. But you're also not completely innocent. That made me laugh softly. No, I said. Life is rarely that simple. Emma nodded. If you hadn't reported the company, my uncle might have avoided prison. Yes. But dozens of families would have been ruined financially. Yes. So either way someone lost. Exactly. Emma looked at the folder one more time. Then she closed it. For 10 years I avoided smiling at you. I chuckled quietly. I noticed. She shook her head slightly. I kept waiting to find proof that you had betrayed my family. And you never did. No. Instead she had discovered something far more uncomfortable. A situation where no one was completely right or completely wrong. Finally Emma stood up from the table. For a moment I wondered if the conversation was simply over. But instead she walked over to the sink, looking out the window. I think my father knew this story would confuse our family, she said quietly. That's probably why he never explained it. She turned back toward me. He died believing the truth mattered more than protecting feelings. That sounds like a good detective. Emma nodded. Then she walked back to the table. And something happened that had never happened in 10 years. She smiled. Not a polite smile. Not the tight expression she used at family dinners. A real one. Warm. Genuine. You know something? She said. What? For years I thought you were hiding something dark. I was. But not the way I imagined. I smiled back. No. Emma picked up the folder and slid it back into her bag. I think Daniel deserves to know the truth. I raised an eyebrow. You're going to tell him? No, she said. You are. I laughed. That's unfair. Maybe. But I think he'll understand. I wasn't entirely sure about that. But Emma seemed confident. She walked toward the door then paused. Margaret. Yes. I owe you an apology. You already gave one. No, she said. That was polite. She stepped closer. For 10 years I treated you like a suspect. That's part of your job. But you were just someone who made a hard decision. I nodded slowly. Yes. Emma studied my face one more time. My uncle's life might have turned out differently if you had stayed silent. Yes. But a lot of innocent people would have suffered. Yes. She took a deep breath. I think my father would have respected the choice you made. That meant more to me than she probably realized. Because her father had been the one man in that investigation who treated me fairly. Emma reached for the door handle. Then she turned back one last time. And now I finally understand something else. What's that? Why Daniel turned out to be such a good man. I raised an eyebrow. Oh, she smiled again. Because he grew up watching you. And with that, she walked out the door. A few minutes later, I watched from the window as her car disappeared down the street. For the first time in 10 years, the quiet distance between us was gone. And later that evening, when Daniel called me as he usually did on Sundays, his first sentence made me smile. "Mom," he said, "Emma told me we need to talk." I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window at the sunset. "Yes," I said, "I think we do."